Hi guys, it's Rory here and welcome to the Football Heritage Podcast. Hope you're enjoying everything that our fantastic podcast has to offer so far this year. Firstly, I'm here to tell you that our brand new patron exclusive feed, the Football Heritage Extra, is now live. You can subscribe for £3 per month and that gives you access to an additional exclusive podcast every Thursday. We've designed our patron exclusive content to be a wee bit more casual, more niche and full of exclusive insights and interviews with our friends, contributors and other people working within football. Links to subscribe are in all of our episodes, show notes as always. Looking forward to seeing you over there. Secondly, if you enjoyed last week's show, it would mean the world to us if you could leave a review on Apple and Spotify, or if you're listening on YouTube, a comment and a like. It really helps the algorithm pick us up and does so much for pushing us in front of new listeners every week. Please remember as well to leave a comment on our episodes on whichever platform you're listening on. One of our favourite things is engaging with you guys and being able to speak with you about the conversations that we're having every week. Lastly, please remember to visit our website to read our articles and see what other projects we're working on at the moment. Or if you like, come and join us on our social media for daily posts and content related to the heritage of football across the world. We're always up for a chat, so if you have any questions, suggestions or feedback, feel free to DM us on any of our socials or email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. I think that's about everything that I need to plug at the moment. Thanks once again for listening. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and I'm joined this morning by David Arrowsmith.
Hi everybody, thanks for having me, Rory.
Not at all, thanks very much for joining me, David. David is the author of Narcoball, which is a book that focuses on football in Pablo Escobar's Colombia and specifically his influence on the game over there. And that is very much going to be the central feature of what it is we're talking about today. David is an author whose writing focuses primarily on the intersection of organised crime, politics and football in South America. And while Narcoball put the spotlight on football in Colombia during Pablo Escobar's reign of narco-terror, his upcoming book Killing Maradona, which is coming out in May, tells the darker story of Maradona's relationship with criminals, cartels and cocaine. So that is really the epicenter of our discussion today and everything that we're going to talk about. Really looking forward to this chat. I read Narcoball and finished it last month, and I think as that kind of entry to politics, society and sport, specifically football within Colombia, it's an absolutely fantastic read. So I recommend to any of our listeners to go and pick it up and read it before Killing Maradona comes out. We'll include links to Narcoball in the show notes for this episode as well, but you can get it in all your usual online retailers and football bookstores. But just before we kick things off properly, David, tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself first of all.
Yes, I think it's a question I get asked quite often actually, is like, how did you come to write this book and why did you write this book, really? Unlike a lot of my peers in the sports book writing realm, I'm not a kind of a published journalist or a personality on television or radio. So this really is quite a personal story for me, and came out of my background and my personal story. So I spent 20 odd years working in television, in documentaries, so sort of related but tangential to this. So I learned a lot of those journalistic skills in coming up with finding, sourcing, pitching stories from the real world. And a lot of them involved crime, a lot of them involved sport, two things that I'm very passionate about. This particular story of Colombian football came about really because I am half Colombian. Your listeners might not realise that from both my name and my voice. I have a very English, very Anglo-Saxon name, and I was born and raised in the UK. But my mother was Colombian, a very patriotic Colombian who moved to Britain in the late 60s. So I was raised in a half British, half Colombian household with my Colombian half brother and half sister and my Colombian mum, and going back to Colombia quite frequently as a child, but increasingly having to stop as the era of Pablo Escobar took hold, really. So I was born in 1979. And I went quite a few times in the early 80s as a very young child with my mum, sometimes with my whole family. But by the sort of later part of the 80s, we stopped going. She stopped taking, a young child to Bogota and Medellin in that era. So I grew up feeling that sort of twin push and pull of being raised in London, all my friends being, predominantly English and British, growing up loving football. And as I got older, starting to explore my connection to my motherland and starting to feel slightly more Colombian and feeling proud to be kind of half Colombian and half British. And actually, the very first football match I went to, my mum took me to Wembley to see England-Colombia in 1988 in a little triangular tournament called the Rouse Cup. Which Scotland took part in as well, and it was my first football match. I was at Old Wembley. My mum had got tickets in the Colombia end and took me and a bunch of my primary school mates, and we sat with all the Colombia fans with all the drums and all the singing, and it was a 1-1 draw. And I didn't realize at the time, but it was kind of the start of the peak era of narco football and that generation of great Colombian football that was so strongly influenced by the cartels. Francisco Pacho Maturana was the manager, and he was also the manager of Atlético Nacional in Medellin, which was going to be bankrolled by Pablo Escobar. And a lot of the players were from that side as well. So the club side that Escobar most obviously bankrolled formed the spine of the national team, including the manager, but also, for example, Andrés Escobar. He actually scored his only ever international goal for Colombia in that game at Wembley. He scored a header to cancel out Gary Lineker's goal, I believe. So it was 1-1. I got to see Carlos Valderrama passing the ball impeccably around the Wembley turf. And I think it was the first time a lot of English fans had seen anything of Colombia. And actually they played really, really well. It wasn't a massively well-attended game, but I think they won a lot of fans and kind of a lot of respect off the back of that performance. So I grew up with that, and then with Italia 90, where again Colombia did really well, but only got knocked out in extra time when Higuita got robbed by Roger Milla when he was doing one of his little walkabouts. And then USA 94. And really USA 94 was the crux of the story for me. I was 14 going on 15 that summer. And, that tragedy of what happened in the American World Cup and the aftermath, the elimination, having been one of the favourites, having beaten Argentina 5-0 in Buenos Aires to qualify, and then the sort of total capitulation on the pitch, and then the murder of Andrés Escobar almost immediately after the squad returned to Colombia. That, as a sort of teenage boy who was avidly following and supporting Colombia in that World Cup, as a sort of parallel England fan, England weren't in that World Cup, so I could be 100% Colombian for that summer. And it was such a shock. And so years later, working in television, I was developing TV program ideas around the intersection of sport and bigger subject matter: history, politics, gender, crime. The fashion these days for those big epic sports stocks is very much, when sport is about more than just sport. And so this was a story that I thought, deserved to be told in more detail than it had been, deserved a wider audience than it had. There's a great, 30 for 30 ESPN documentary called The Two Escobars, but that's quite an old documentary now. And I think a lot of fans, big fans of football and big fans of sports stocks might have seen it, but I think the wider world isn't really aware of that. So I developed this story as a documentary, and then in the end I got the chance to write it as a book instead.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think this era of football for Colombia specifically, it's one of the great kind of paradoxes. On one hand, you've got everyone who goes nuts over the nostalgia factor of it. Carlos Valderrama with his hair and that amazing Colombian yellow kit. René Higuita with how eccentric he was as a goalkeeper. And, the entire makeup of the Colombian national team brings back so many memories for people who, we always see these underdogs come up and we all love to relive their stories. But you dig deeper and there is so much more behind why that squad was made up the way that it was, and it's because of narco-terrorism. And in many ways, it's a great shame, but also you have all these aspects like Andrés Escobar, and I think that's one of my favourite parts about the book, is that it really starts and ends with him. But obviously, through popular, like the Netflix TV show Narcos, people will always assume that Narcoball is tied to him specifically, and yes, while he did really drive forward what Narcoball is, it didn't necessarily start or end with him. Yes, well, he did put a lot of the foundations in place for it to thrive. The involvement of cartels within football began much earlier and ended well after his death, and became a lot more brutal after his death as well. So I think that's what we need to remember when we talk about this. Best place for us to start at the moment is football in Colombia pre-Escobar, particularly in the 50s and 60s when you had this Maverick Breakaway League, which really kind of sets the tone for how things would eventually become in Colombia and their place within the world football stage.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it does all start, in the late 40s, early 50s. And again, I had this idea, and the more I researched and the more I wrote it, the more it all just seemed to tie up and kind of come full circle in this bizarre way. Because the Colombian football story does kind of really kick off and start in 1948, 1949, early 50s, which is this era called El Dorado, which is like this kind of gold rush, golden age of Colombian football. The first one. And that comes about because Colombian football is at that moment operating outside the auspices of FIFA. They're not being controlled by FIFA, and their finances and their wage and salary structures and all that kind of stuff have no input from FIFA. And so when there's a strike in Argentinian football, they're able to offer riches to players to defect from Argentinian football to come and play in Colombia. Famously, Alfredo Di Stefano joins Millonarios of Bogota and plays there for, I think, 4 seasons, wins a ton of trophies, totally develops his game, and it's a big part of how he's credited with becoming one of the world's greatest players is the time he spent playing in Colombia.
It also, just as a side note, Alfredo Di Stefano also played alongside Bobby Flamel with Millonarios during that time, who was a Hearts forward and started his career with the junior club Cricket Rob Roy.
Yes, that's it. And so they were able to kind of attract talent from all over in this particular moment, and again, it's inextricably linked to several things, to politics, to money, to violence, and to a very small degree to that impacts on Pablo, because this is actually the period in which he is born.
Yeah.
And he is born into a period called La Violencia, which is, to all intents and purposes, a kind of political civil war in Colombia. It claims the lives of 200,000 people. A lot of violence, especially in the countryside, where Pablo grows up. He is born into this violence, sees it firsthand as a child. His family are very nearly murdered in their village. And it's that leads to them moving to Medellin. So in this moment, this money is being used to attract foreign talent to a growing Colombian football league that is viewed, I think, by the politicians as being a perfect distraction for the masses from the political upheaval and violence that is consuming the country. And at the same time, Pablo is experiencing that and learning that and seeing that. So I think he kind of was indelibly inked with that idea that money, power, violence, and to this small degree, football were all kind of potentially linked. And it's a lesson he displays as he gets older. He sees the value of power, money, politics, and he sees the role that football can play as that kind of bread and circuses way of distracting the masses. He is that kind of Roman imperial figure that, leads alone and bestows his riches and uses it to influence and corrupt.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it. He's very much that orator. And like you said, as we'll get on to later, he knew the value of the power of the mob, the power of the masses, and why it's important to keep the poorest people within society on your side and in your pocket. And much like the rest of Latin America during this period, the wealth disparity in Colombia was huge, absolutely off the scale. And that's something that obviously influenced Pablo as well, growing up in a very poor family, famously having to flee the neighborhoods in which they lived, to flee the violence that was going on from the rebel forces. But also the narcotics trade at this point wasn't to the same degree as it was in the 80s, because cocaine was obviously a thing, the coca trade was a thing, but it hadn't reached America yet, really. Hadn't really become as widespread as it was. And really, the only thing that you could point to as being part of the narcotics trade at this point in Colombia largely marijuana and to a lesser degree heroin as well. So, you've kind of got those extremes, and although it was a large industry and a very dark industry, it was nowhere near the levels that it would become and what it's become known for now.
No, absolutely. I think, Pablo learnt the criminal ropes through being involved with the likes of tobacco smugglers, marijuana smugglers, and really what he was, kind of at the forefront of was pioneering this move to cocaine. Originally, as he got involved in that, that was something where they were importing the coca, smuggling the coca over the border as well. It wasn't, really even being grown in sufficient quantities in Colombia for their purposes, and it was being refined in Colombia and then moved on. So, part of what happened was that move from illegal smuggling and other forms of illegal drugs and marijuana, which was, an illegal cash business, but on a far smaller scale by necessity, really. And I think part of what happened was that Colombia's primary kind of legal crop, a big pillar of the economy, was coffee, and there was a global financial meltdown that collapsed the coffee industry, collapsed the price of coffee, decimated the kind of value of coffee as a crop. And what sprung up to fill that gap was coca. And so suddenly there was this new crop that was, perfect for the conditions in Colombia, perfect to be grown there and to replace coffee. And then suddenly there was this massive supply. And that was what, Pablo was then able to completely leverage that to create this pipeline. And like you say, to then exploit that by getting it out to predominantly to America. That was a change that happened during his lifetime where he was perfectly placed, the right man at the right time. He'd learned the ropes. As I say, he had all these smuggler's tricks that he'd grown up, learning, and he could just apply them to this new industry, this new crop that was, by a factor of 10, 50, 100 times more valuable than anything that had come before, really.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, in your book, here we're talking about the legacies that Narcoball, the era of Narcoball, has left behind. But in your book, what I like is that you look at it through the lens of football. And, there's so many books and publications out there that cover Pablo's criminal life extensively, whereas this is much more of a look at the wider society and the contextual reasons why the era of Narcoball happened and obviously the devastation that it caused. But Pablo Escobar always had a deep obsession with football. It wasn't the case that, although he did know the power of controlling football, the power that can bring, he wasn't doing it because he solely knew it was powerful. He did love football. He always had a deep love of football. And part of that was growing up being a fan of Atlético Nacional, who were at the time one of the biggest clubs in Colombia, but were sorely underperforming at the time.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that really sort of clinched the idea for me, was the realization that he did love football. He loved money and power, and I think he loved power possibly the most, up there with football, the two passions probably. But that he did have these strong passions in his life: money and power, football, and his family, which I think is something that we might all share, but is I think a lot of psychopaths also have this sort of desire to protect their progeny and their family, and there's a level of pride and so on that comes with that. But I think more than anything, that's where I found a small way to connect with him, was through his love of football. I think it's quite hard to write a book like this if you have no real touchstone for how you can connect with that character. And what I noticed was that he did actually have, for his entire life, from start to finish, a deep love for football, and that's something that no book could ever actually put down. And lots of the books and documentaries have little anecdotal stories of his interaction with football, but none of them had actually gone out there and said he actually loved football from the moment he was born almost to the moment he died. And that had a huge impact on Colombian football and Colombian life. And it's, it's there from the moments where he's growing up as a boy in Medellin and he has a plastic bag filled with rags because he can't afford a football. And that's what he's kicking around in the streets with his brother Roberto, and then getting, busted by the cops because he's getting up to no good while he's having a kickabout in the dust, and allegedly his first boots were football cleats, football boots. That may be an apocryphal story, but he had this love of football. He was always wanting to play football, not just as a kid. When he was rich and powerful, he would buy these ranches, he would buy these offices, he would buy developments, and anywhere he was going to be for any length of time, the first thing he did was make sure there was a football pitch and a football goal, so that he could, and when he should have been working, when he wasn't working, what he was actually doing was having a kickabout with his brother or with his henchmen or, with the footballers whose salaries he paid. And so I saw that thread throughout his life, and, his desire to bring footballing success to Medellin and to Colombia, albeit not altruistic, albeit always with that purpose of power and control and protection, specifically from extradition and becoming bigger than the law. But there are any number of ways you can choose to do that. Likewise, there are any number of ways you can choose to launder money. And he and his brother decided, we're going to launder money through football. But then he also decided, I'm not just going to launder money through football. I'm actually going to invest. I'm actually going to put my dollars into here, which he had no particular need to do whatsoever. So he invested a huge amount of time and energy. He had football pitches built. He had floodlights built. He brought, all of this to the barrios of Medellin. There was always a reason for it. But he chose football because he loved football. And I was looking at the stories of how he flew the players up to playing games with him. And he clearly loved playing as well as watching and supporting. And I think he sort of fancied himself as a bit of a player. And one of the stories that sort of readers and reviewers picked up on most, I think, was the story of when he had Diego Maradona brought and smuggled into La Catedral. And that's just one of those moments that is, kind of crazier than fiction. He's the disgraced greatest footballer in the world. He's just been prosecuted in Argentina for cocaine possession. He's on a worldwide ban for using cocaine during his time at Napoli. And he gets this kind of invitation to come and play with somebody rich and important in Colombia. And he just kind of doesn't think any more about it and, gets on the next plane to Colombia. And lo and behold, he's kind of smuggled into this luxury prison, plays football with El Patron, who he claims he doesn't really know who he is. And with Maradona, you can never quite be sure, but I can kind of half believe he kind of doesn't want to ask too many questions. And he plays this game, behind closed doors, friendly with Pablo. And you can see in his interactions with Pablo that Pablo sees them as kindred spirits. And Maradona kind of really, I think, doesn't quite believe that and pushes back against that. But having written both this book and subsequently my new book on Maradona, actually, I see what Pablo was getting at. Yeah. Diego had a very similar upbringing. And I think his story could have been very different. If Pablo had been as good at football as Diego was and had been in Argentina where there was better football infrastructure than in Colombia, maybe he would have been a footballer instead of a narco, and vice versa. They had very similar backgrounds. I think Pablo thought he was a bit of a baller. I think he thought of himself as a bit of a little mini Maradona. They have almost identical statures, bizarrely enough. I think they're literally the same height. Pablo is older and fatter, but he's a sort of fancies himself as this kind of right-footed right winger who cuts inside on his left foot, tries to do a few tricks, and I think he really thought, I could have been a footballer. If I wasn't a billionaire narco, I could have been a footballer. And he likes to surround himself with footballers. He likes to go to matches. He watches games, listens to games. Even when he's on the run, he follows what's happening in football.
Yep.
And I kind of had this epiphany that if I somehow had ended up being a billionaire narco-terrorist, what would I have done with my money? Would I have ploughed it into my hometown clubs? Would I have identified the greatest footballer, arguably, that ever lived, certainly the greatest footballer on the planet in that moment, I think, and gone, I want to play with him. I'm gonna get him to come and play with me. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? Who wouldn't want to play with Maradona? So it was those moments that made me realize, one, how much he loved football, and two, that was a small way that I could identify with Pablo, the person, the human, albeit the horrifically flawed and ultimately evil human being that he was.
Yeah, some really important points to touch on there. I think just to touch on what you said at the end of your sentence there, that, and I think, to be fair, I think the Netflix the documentary series done a lot for this, but obviously a lot of people see and still view Pablo Escobar as being a hero. And he very much painted himself as a Robin Hood figure. We've had a number of conversations on this podcast about different individuals throughout the history of football. None of them are particularly easy to break down because there are so many complexities to them. And Pablo Escobar is possibly one of the most complex. But it's like you said, it's about connecting with him and finding a way that you can connect and almost, kind of humanize him. That's how the book starts, and it's a perfect way to start it because it is literally talking about Pablo on the run from the Colombian Special Forces, the American DEA, and as his sidekick at the time is scouting around for, these people who are trying to hunt and kill him, Pablo is sitting on the radio listening to a football match. Do you know what I mean? While he's on the run, screaming, telling his henchmen, "Oh, we scored!" And that is, in a lot of ways, like you said, if you put yourself in his shoes, you can imagine yourself doing that. And I think it's that sort of childlike attachment to the game that can resonate with all of us at the same time. But then on the other hand of things, you've also, kind of need to dig down into why it was he then used football in the way that he did, because like many politicians, many dictators and other figures of power and great complexity throughout history, he realised that football is a way to legitimise what he was doing and to legitimise his person. And I think we need to obviously bring that up as well, because he knew that having that power and what it brought to him in terms of being able to influence people, particularly at the lowest levels of society who can all relate to football, he knew what that could do for him in terms of political power. And we can't forget that part of his, for a long time actually, his sole aim was to become the president of Colombia. And he knew that having that power, being able to utilise it whenever he wanted to, would be massively important in doing what he did. And it was, ultimately. And that's why he used football as well. Of course, it's a great tool to be able to use it in that way. But when you were talking there about Pablo and Diego, and obviously there's the one side of things where he was building football pitches in the poor slums of Medellin so that he could provide football for people that could go and use pitches. And of course, that's where René Higuita grew up playing the game, and so many other Colombian footballers. On the other hand, when it gets to the point where he's in this very private prison, La Catedral, which is barely a prison, it's a prison only in name really, he's inviting different football clubs to come and play against 11-a-side teams that he's picked. And it is almost that kind of psychopathic tendency to want to show yourself up to these people. And of course, they're too scared to actually play properly against them in fear of what could actually happen to them. So just such a complex character, but there's so much we could talk about in terms of his influence and impact on the wider game in Colombia. But I mean, yeah, it's incredible how much involvement he actually had in football. Like you said, because he genuinely just loved the sport.
Absolutely. And I think you're right that, there was a purpose to a lot of it. It was always power. And I think it started off as politics and it became more and more football. And that's one of the kind of theories, kind of part of the thesis of my book, I guess, is that he always loved football. He was always involving himself in football. But, as well as building pitches and bringing floodlights to pitches and opening pitches and supporting local initiatives and local clubs, he was also doing lots of other sort of, in inverted commas, or not even in inverted commas, charitable work. He was bringing electricity to the poorest parts of Medellin. He was having schools and hospitals built.
Yep.
Things that he was doing was creating employment and to some extent hope, albeit ensnared in his infrastructure that made it very, very dangerous and very, complicated.
Yep.
But he was doing all of those things and not explicitly just football. That was all during his, like you say, his ambition, his political ambition timeline, basically. And I think it's something that a lot of people maybe don't know about him, actually, is the extent to his political ambition and his political success. He did, get elected to local council. And then he was elected as a suplente, which is a stand-in to the Colombian parliament. So when as it were, the local Colombian MP for his area was not available to attend parliament, Pablo was authorized to attend in his place. That was sufficient political office for him to be protected under the law as an elected politician, which meant he was protected from prosecution, and most importantly for him, he was protected from extradition. And this was one of the biggest issues for Pablo throughout his life and career, was the fear of extradition. And the law kept changing in Colombia as his control of it strengthened and weakened, and the political will strengthened and weakened, where, it was a key issue was, should it be legal for Colombian citizens to be extradited and forcibly sent to America to face American justice on American soil? And that was Pablo's, I think, absolute single biggest fear. He was viscerally terrified of the idea of that. He knew that in Colombia, he had already been imprisoned in Colombia, and he had got his way out by hook or by crook. He knew that he could bribe people, he could influence judges, he could be broken out of jail if he needed to be. He could evade justice in Colombia, but what he was very scared of was justice from America and justice in America. When he was very briefly a suplente, he was protected, but almost immediately that rug was pulled from under him. He was outed as a narco. Finally, people kind of said, the scales fall from our eyes. We know what he is really. He's not the Paisa Robin Hood. He's not a philanthropist, businessman. He's a narco. And as soon as that was called out publicly in Parliament, his political career was in tatters. And my theory is kind of that it's at that point he needed a replacement to protect him. He was no longer legally protected from extradition and prosecution. He needed something else to protect him. And the answer to that was the people, the masses that you referred to earlier, being loved and protected by the masses of Medellin and sufficiently the masses of the poor of Colombia, who would love him for his championing of football and championing of Colombia, and also the money and, in his eyes, I guess, kind of hope that he was giving them through his industry that he was building, employing their children, albeit as sicarios and drug runners and smugglers and whatever else. But, his money was propping up those communities and those families. And football was bringing, hope to those communities and to the country. And so I think he sort of pivoted from the political dream fading and collapsing to, okay, I need to be so beloved and so popular and so big in this country that I'm kind of untouchable. I'm above the law. I'm above politics. And so then he kind of really ramped up, I think, the footballing ambitions.
Yeah, we still see politicians doing it today, when one of them's called out for, rightly being racist or doing something incredibly egregious, being xenophobic or whatever, instead of apologising and admitting they were wrong, they double down. Not just even politicians, influencers and stuff like that as well, YouTube stars, they double down, and they do that because they know that they are more likely to get support from the people that they are doubling down in favour of, as opposed to getting it back if they do choose to apologise. That's exactly what Pablo Escobar done. It's a political tactic that's been used for years and years. And that's exactly what he's done here, because he knew that, instead of fighting the battle that he was never going to win, he went back to the people who he knew would support him no matter what. Because, like you said, he's provided their families with security, given them homes, electricity, infrastructure that these people in suits never gave them. And importantly, just on the topic of suits, it was something that Pablo always reticently wore, and even refused to wear a tie to his inauguration as a politician because he didn't want to appear as being one of them, and he only ever did because they wouldn't let him into the Parliament building without one. And it just really speaks to how much he was how much he wanted to win the favour of the masses, because again, he knew that would bring him power. And obviously one way to do that was by getting involved in football. Eventually, I think all of Colombia's top teams had some influence of narco money flowing into them because of it. It's always, people are like, well, he couldn't have made that much money. But I think it's probably the case that it's just incomprehensible the amount of money that he was actually making and that other cartels were actually making. They had to launder it some way, to the point where they were burying money and like caches underground and stuff like that. It's just absolutely crazy numbers. But eventually it came to be that all of Colombia's top clubs were owned and influenced and being moneyballed by cartels and the money that was coming in from the cocaine trade.
That's right. I mean, I think, like I say, he sort of pivoted to football. He wanted to be a politician and he thought he could ingratiate himself into that blue blood elite world through his money and his influence. And I think he underestimated, the kind of snobbery and the divide between the haves and the have-nots and the old power. And he was kind of new money, new power. And he thought he could bludgeon his way into politics. And when he realized that that was no longer possible, like you say, he needed to then be the Paisa Robin Hood, the man of the people. And he kind of doubled down on his, I'm one of you, I'm just a poor Paisa from Medellin, albeit I'm actually a billionaire. And so he doubled down on football. He invested hugely in football. And like you say, it was this whole era where it had sort of very softly launched, soft start with Union Magdalena, which was the club that Carlos Valderrama had started out at. And they had had some investment from a marijuana smuggling cooperative, but in a small way, and it didn't lead to any major success, and it didn't really change anything. And what did change things was the Cali cartel investing in America de Cali, one of the two big sides in Cali. Pablo investing very heavily in Atlético Nacional, but also supporting DIM, Deportivo Independiente Medellin. Both Medellin clubs, the Medellin cartel were heavily involved in. And then even his sort of number two, his henchman in Bogota, El Mexicano, the Mexican was his nickname, Rodriguez Gacha. He took sort of control of Millonarios in Bogota. And so those four clubs started to dominate Colombian football, especially actually America de Cali. Initially, they spent a lot of money in getting international quality players from abroad. They started to dominate the domestic league and the domestic competitions. And what was quite interesting, again, I think people know a bit about Colombian national football, but a lot less about Colombian domestic football. And what was quite interesting was to see that rivalry grow domestically, where America de Cali was suddenly the team to beat. But what was happening was that they kept falling at the final hurdle in the Copa Libertadores, which is the Champions League of South American football. Colombia, the club side, had never won the Copa Libertadores. And America de Cali, I think, lost in 2 or 3 finals on the bounce, came agonizingly close to winning. And I think seeing that, Pablo thought, here's a way that I can get one over on my friends, enemies, rivals, as they were at various times in Cali. And actually, what I really want is Atlético Nacional to be the first Colombian side to win the Copa Libertadores. We will win it for Colombia, we'll win it for Medellin, and we'll stick 2 fingers up at the boys from Cali who've been trying and failing. And so that became really a huge thing for him, and he put all his weight behind it, and he succeeded. But what that meant was that as people realized the influence he'd had in that victory, it put this huge asterisk next to that title win. And the sad thing about that, I was thinking about it recently, is that actually Atlético Nacional were a brilliant team, but to all intents and purposes, they won the final under their own steam. Actually, he tried to bribe the officials for the final and failed, and Atlético Nacional won on penalties at the last gasp. But they probably deserved to win all the games going up to there, and they probably were the best side in South America. And they were an excellent team. They had an excellent manager, and if Pablo hadn't been involved, they could quite conceivably have won that tournament anyway. Having said that, easy to say if Pablo hadn't been involved, but they were an excellent side because he'd already been involved. He'd already hired that manager,
yes,
Pacho Maturana. He'd already bankrolled the club so that they could retain that talent. One of the most interesting things, though, I think, about that team is that strategy that I think he developed alongside Maturana. It was something I think they were aligned on, which was, we're going to make Atlético Nacional the team of Medellin and the team of Colombia. And where America de Cali spent money on foreign players, Atlético Nacional were 100% Colombian all the way through. Starting 11, bench, squad, and Maturana, the manager, everybody was Colombian, and a large percentage of those players were from Medellin, and a lot of them had been identified playing on the pitches that Pablo had built and in the structures that he had grown. So they created this incredible pipeline of young talent from Medellin into Atlético Nacional and then into the national team, which was managed by the same manager. And it created this spine of Colombian football that led to that great era in the 90s, early 90s for Colombia.
Yeah, exactly. There's this lineage that you can trace from the teams that Pablo Escobar was involved in, right back to the pitches that he built, the different infrastructures that he put in place. And that's where his influence is most widely felt. But I think just to really kind of drive it home for people listening, like the influence of the cartels over their football teams was incredibly wide-reaching. It just wasn't the case that they were putting money into them. They were picking the managers, they were picking the teams, they were swapping players between one another. It literally was like a lot of the conspiracy theories that a lot of people talk about today between like football clubs, jokingly or not, like that is what was happening ultimately. There was just so much of this going on.
And in Bogota, you know, a player who was playing for Millonarios would know that he could not leave Millonarios by hook or by crook unless El Mexicano said so, you know, and he could just literally hold them hostage to play for his football team. And equally, Pablo, going back to the extradition issue, when the sort of general manager of one of his club sides in Medellin was forcibly extradited to America at a time actually when it was a bit of a grey area, but where extradition wasn't enshrined in the Constitution, wasn't necessarily actually legal. He was flown out to America and put in prison in America. And Pablo was so incensed and fearful as a result of this, he called together all his cronies who were invested in and running all the top football clubs in the Colombian league system, called them all together at one of his ranches, had this big summit and said,
"That's right, yeah.
We're gonna bring the league to a halt. We're gonna use our muscle here, and we're gonna stop Colombian football because they've just sent my guy from, you know, who's running this club for me. They've just sent him to America, and he's in prison in America. This can't be allowed to happen." And he actually got the entire league to down tools and refuse to play for a week until part of that element of it got sorted out. So he was coercing, you know, referees. He ended up later having a referee killed. He was bribing officials, possibly bribing opposition as well. But he was also, you know, effectively bringing football to a complete standstill in the country. So, like you say, and it wasn't just him, and there were other players involved, as it were, other cartel leaders and other senior criminals involved. But he was very much at the forefront of it. He was the one blowing the trumpet and banging the drum for all of this. And again, you hinted at it earlier, but it partly comes down to his personality, I think, and his character and his ego. And the way he conducted himself was very different to how the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, who ran the Cali cartel, conducted themselves. Yes, they invested in football, but they like to fly under the radar, and Pablo liked to be the center of attention, you know, and that was perhaps his greatest flaw, really.
Yeah, and I think just a point on extradition as well, that one of the reasons that this was so important it wasn't actually just so important to Pablo, actually, it was important to a lot of people throughout Latin America. I think just to briefly touch on the relationship between Latin American nations and the United States of America during this period of time, who they very much viewed as being the modern colonizer. And of course, obviously, there was intervention from America in Panama and Nicaragua, very much left a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of Latin American nations for a number of reasons. And the idea that you could be sent from your home country to this foreign oppressor to be tried and have whatever happened to you was horrible for many people, as it would be for anyone across the world. But you're absolutely right that the reason that Pablo got involved in all of these things was that he could hold power. And obviously this began manifesting itself in the fact that his manipulation didn't just stop at bribes. It then went so far as to be killing people. And, you know, you mentioned earlier on, ultimately Pablo Escobar as an evil man because of the types of things that he was telling others to do. He very, very rarely done it himself, didn't like doing the dirty work himself. He very much got other people to go and do it. But he was getting officials killed at the end of the day. He was threatening them with violence, threatening their families with violence, and this type of manipulation is something that continued up until his death.
Absolutely. It's a difficult thing, and it's a hard line to tread. And it's one of the questions I get asked a lot is, why did you write this book? And do people, how do people react to it? And as someone, who professes a sort of proud love of his motherland, like, how did you feel writing it? And I do get that. And I hope in the book it comes across as what it is to me, which is a sort of love letter to Colombian football and to my motherland, very much inspired by my mother, who died shortly after the book was published and who was a proud Colombian. And I think her reaction to the book initially, when I told her about the project at the beginning, was sort of, oh God, not again, not more Pablo. Colombians are done with Pablo years ago. That was a dark time. They've moved on. The country is vibrant and beautiful and has, found its feet. It's not like a lot of nations, maybe not in the absolute best place it's ever been right this moment. But the last, couple of decades have seen a very different Colombia to the Colombia of the 80s and 90s. But it was something where I knew I couldn't shy away from who Pablo was and what he did. But what I wanted was the full historical context for people to understand what that meant for the Colombian players and what happened at USA 94, that it couldn't be separated from decades of violence, murder, intimidation, terrorism, and control and coercion. And I think it's almost completely unprecedented, the level of pressure that they were under to go to a World Cup and try to perform when your families and your own lives are being threatened, directly threatened by people who have killed thousands of people. Just would not be allowed to happen if anybody knew about it now. You just can't imagine England going to a World Cup and then it coming out that some kind of English terrorist organization or whatever was saying, we're going to kill your wife and child if you don't pick this player instead of this player. Or so I wanted to explain all of that. And part of that was showing the lengths to which Pablo would go, not just for football, but just in general, that he would have hundreds, if not thousands, of police officers murdered, by offering a bounty for killing a policeman. He would blow up a passenger jet and kill over 100 people in a bid to kill a politician who he didn't like. And the politician wasn't even on the plane in the end, and instead he just killed over 100 innocent people and achieved next to nothing. He was an incredibly awful person who did the worst things imaginable. And that is part of his story, Colombia's story, and the story of Colombian football. I hope it's not the only and not necessarily the abiding story, but I feel like you do a disservice to the players and you do a disservice to the nation and what it endured and what it has got to now if you sort of sugarcoat that. So I was keen to show and describe and explain those lengths that he would go to because they were extraordinary. And he was the world's first narco-terrorist. The phrase was created for him because nobody had ever gone to those lengths before in combining the drug industry with war on the state. He went to war with the Colombian state and to a lesser degree with America, basically. And that's how he aligned himself. And it was completely unprecedented. But he was the seventh richest man in the world at the time, and he could afford a private army and he could afford to bribe and corrupt officials within the police force, the army, and the political, organizations within Colombia in order to also protect himself.
Yeah, of course, he eventually meets his end in 1993, spends literally years hiding out in different safe houses, being surrounded on all fronts, trying to bargain many times, and eventually he is caught and he's killed. At this point, that's in 1993, Narcoball, the era of Narcoball, is still at one of its highs, but is very much starting to come down now. And obviously, you mentioned at the beginning of our chat today, USA 94, the capitulation on the field for many of the Colombian players. And of course, like you said there, the pressure that a lot of them are feeling from different cartels, from different narcos who can find their families, who have easy access to their families, their children, wives, etc. must have been huge. And, those descriptions, those photos of the players crying after matches that they've lost, shaking in interviews because they know exactly what's to come. And this reaches a head when Andres Escobar is gunned down outside of a nightclub by one of these cartels. You framed it perfectly in the book that just because Pablo Escobar had died didn't mean any of this had went away. Power creates a vacuum, and often that vacuum is filled by people who are far more extreme and far more violent.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. I think, the sort of sad tragedy of it all is that if Pablo hadn't been dead by USA 94, and certainly if he had not only been alive, but perhaps still at the height of his power, that tournament would have gone very differently for Colombia.
One of the most poignant lines in the book is that had El Patron still been alive, then Andres Escobar probably wouldn't have died.
Yeah, I think he was the golden boy. He was the golden boy of Colombia. He was the golden boy of Atlético Nacional, which was the team that Pablo had bankrolled more than any other. He was Pablo's guy, and Pacho Maturana was Pablo's manager. And with El Patron alive and powerful, they would have been protected, above and beyond anybody else. And actually, instead what happens is his power is eroded. He goes, as you say, he goes on the run. The DEA and the Colombian authorities start to get a grip on him, take down his organization, take down his access to his funds, to the point where he's almost completely alone and on the run. One of the last moments, where you get an insight into his life is at the Casa Azul, the Blue House, where he's visited by his wife. And he watches Colombia beat Argentina 5-0 in Buenos Aires. And it's the last time, I think it's almost the last time she sees him and the last time she ever sees him happy. And he's happy for days after that game because Colombia have beaten Argentina in Buenos Aires. It's the first home World Cup qualifier Argentina have ever lost. They haven't lost in Argentina for 6 years or something. It's a seismic result. It's a 5-0 win. Colombia are going to the World Cup. But by this point, he's lost almost all his power, almost all his protection. He dies just days after that game. And the World Cup comes round 7 or 8 months after that. And as you say, there's now a power vacuum. The Medellin cartel is disintegrated. And there's this opportunity now for new players and different players within the existing structures to try to leverage, force their hand to gain control. And it becomes very lawless, very dangerous. There is, to some extent, this sort of law and order and control and honor amongst thieves while Pablo is alive. And you've got this violent opposition as it ends up being with the Cali cartel. But, at one point they're working together. They fall out, they're no longer working together. But people know what is going on. People know who is answerable to who. Ultimately, everybody associated with the Medellin cartel is answerable to Pablo and go against him and feel his wrath. And once he is gone, it's fair game. Everything is fair game. And I think that chaos is the backdrop to the Colombian side leaving Colombia, arriving in America. And then, as you say, having to perform under this incredible pressure. So I think the biggest part of that book really is, for me, is for people to understand how much above and beyond the normal level of pressure they were operating under. And I watched back a lot of the matches in the process of researching the book. And when you look at it again through that context, at the time, you can hear commentators refer, the Colombians look a bit nervous, and everybody, I think, just got the impression it's a big World Cup. Pele's hyped them up. Everybody thinks they're going to do really well. Maybe they can't cope with the pressure, of being no longer also rans or dark horses, but actually potential champions. And I wanted to kind of dispel that myth that they choked on a normal level of pressure, of footballing and sporting pressure. It's actually, as you say, you see them line up for the national anthems and they are haunted. Their eyes are dark. They're like dead behind their eyes. They're not just nervous. They are in fear of their lives. And you see their reaction to their own goal. Andres Escobar can't get up off the pitch. I mean, he just goes down and it's like he's been shot, and they know this is life or death. This is not just football. And that is not normal. And I just wanted people to see that and appreciate that and realize they didn't choke because they couldn't handle the pressure. And it wasn't that they weren't a good team. It wasn't that they weren't good enough. They were just operating in circumstances the likes of which hopefully we will never see again. And certainly most of us will never experience and can never truly understand.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess moving on from the narco side of things, obviously, part of the reason we're having this conversation is all about legacies and the lineages that we can draw back to. Obviously, 2014 was massive for Colombia for a number of reasons. Absolute joy watching them. I remember I was 18. That was my first World Cup, and it was the year I turned 18. So I was in the pub every match, watching it, taking full advantage of that. It was amazing. One thing that I wanted to know, and this is maybe a good point for us to kind of finish up on, what is the legacy of Narcoball today? Because obviously having such a wide reach, having put that amount of money not just into football clubs but football infrastructure in different parts of the country, building communities around these football pitches, it's not something that can just be taken away or removed overnight. It's not something that dilutes over the space of 3 decades. It's something that lasts for a very, very long time. What is the legacy of Narcoball today, and is there still narco influence within football in Colombia?
I think it would be naive to say that no, there isn't any influence anymore in Colombia. I'm absolutely sure that there is. I would argue that there is there are corrupting influences in the broadest sense in almost all football these days. Football is too big a business not to have that. And we've seen it in other countries. And I think we sort of conveniently forget it, especially in the UK. But, if you can have corruption in Italian football, in Serie A, with Juventus and things like that, then to believe that it would never happen anywhere else and only in these sort of foreign places, I think is incredibly naive. So I would argue that I think there are levels of corruption or corrupting influences all over football from the highest level. And that, part of what this book is about sports washing in a way. He was almost one of the first, people to use football as reputational sports washing. And I think that has never been more current than it is in today's era, not just with football, but certainly with football all around the globe. So I guess there's a small legacy, maybe even there, that almost got kicked off with Pablo and the cartels. In terms of Colombia, I feel like 2014 was fantastic. And I feel like that was kind of the first new cycle that felt almost completely post-Narcoball. Generation of players that were not really alive or not really playing when Pablo and the cartels were in their pomp. And so that generation of James Rodriguez feels just about separated. There are links, there are still those pitches. A lot of them have been renamed, but there is still some of that youth infrastructure. What there isn't is the money that there was. So, I think that all came out as the cartels collapsed, and it set Colombia back for a long time. But what they had done is put Colombia on the map as a footballing nation that had talent. And I think it led to a lot of Colombian players playing overseas after that. Faustino Asprilla being the first kind of big one. Obviously, Valderrama was the very first, really. So I think the cartels, and particularly Atlético Nacional, kept talent in Colombia. When they collapsed, actually what that enabled was the talent to be freed of the shackles of the narcos and be able to go abroad. Sadly, Andrés Escobar was going to be one of the first to do that. He was due to sign for AC Milan, and then he was killed before he could complete that transfer. But I think so that legacy of that pipeline that put Colombia on the map and then led to some of the best players then being able to go and play in some of the top leagues was a sort of long-term positive benefit. And then coming back to James Rodriguez, I guess one of the small, existing remnants of all of that, although it has now sort of distanced itself very much from that era, is the existence of Envigado FC, which was originally created and supported, and to some extent, I think, bankrolled by cartel money and cartel support in Medellin. It was all part of that infrastructure of getting that pipeline of players, young players from the barrios of Medellin. and they were on the Clinton list, which was the list of kind of terrorist organizations associated with drug trafficking.
Wow.
But they have not been on that for a very long time, and that club still exists and is still very successful and is one of the kind of premier talent pipelines in Colombia. And so they brought through James Rodriguez. They also brought through John Duran, whose career has gone off the rails somewhat spectacularly. But nevertheless, it is a genuine talent, and was scoring Champions League goals for Aston Villa not that long ago. So putting Colombia on the map, creating some kind of local talent pipeline, and then the collapse perhaps allowing some of those players to spread their wings abroad, I think were all legacies of that era. It brought success. The collapse of it brought a real sort of retrenchment and a bit of a collapse. But maybe overall long term, without that era, Colombian football was kind of irrelevant, I would argue. It was not Argentinian football. It was not Brazilian football. It didn't have their money. It didn't have the pedigree of Uruguayan football even. They were the big nations in South America. And it was really only winning the Copa Libertadores and then starting to compete on an international stage that I think brought Colombian football out. And so, now I think the nation's, in a good place, especially with the football. There's a lot of Colombian talent all around the world, all around the British leagues, but throughout Europe. And the national side, are doing really well. And I'm sort of quietly optimistic about their chances at the World Cup. It's so much of it is about context, and it is interlaced with this complex history that is as negative as it is positive. But that's what I hope the book is a kind of telling you the story of how we got there. And it does come up, pretty present day. And I reference the kidnapping of Luis Diaz's parents in the book. And the book came out just before the Copa America, when Colombia only lost in extra time in the final to Argentina. Colombia so nearly won the Copa America just a couple of years ago. So it's back to being hopefully a good era for Colombian football, but it wouldn't exist and be what it was without this era.
Yeah, I'll put my money on a Colombia-Scotland final at the World Cup this year. It'd be a great sight.
Game, I think.
But absolutely. And I think just to kind of echo the words and the sentiment of your mother, David, like this, ultimately, a lot of modern day perceptions of Colombia is this era. Cocaine, murder, violence, corruption, etc. But that's not what Colombia is. Colombia is an incredibly beautiful country. The people are incredibly generous. There's so much more to the nation than this ultimately small period of time. It did have such a large impact, but this is not what Colombia is ultimately, and obviously that's something that you wanted to get across in the book as well. But like you also said, there's been a bit of a knowledge gap here in terms of what people have written about, and it's also important for people to know exactly the extent of what was happening and a lot of the depths that people were willing to go to maintain this type of control over football clubs, politics, and society within Colombia. And of course, as we all know, we need to take these lessons from history so that we make sure that they don't happen again, ultimately.
Exactly.
Is there anything else that you want to add just before we finish up for today?
I think I just wanted to echo that really and say, I think my hope with the book is that what I learned, I think, from working in documentaries for so many years is the idea of kind of educating through stealth and through entertainment. And that this is a book that I wanted to be very accessible, very entertaining to read. If you do like Narcos, if you have watched Griselda, if you love football, there's something in here, I think, for everyone, because you're never further than a few pages from a penalty shootout, a sending off, or a horrific act of narco-terrorism. So it's packed with moments that will hopefully keep you hooked. But what I really wanted it to do actually ultimately was to help people understand a bit of where Colombia came from, but really to win some new fans for the country and for the football team. And I hope that people kind of reading it will be more interested in Colombia, be more interested in Colombian football. And although this is a dark period, will kind of come out of it with feeling like they know more than they did before, and that makes them sympathetic, and kind of Colombia might be their second team, or they might take that holiday to Cartagena or to Medellin, because it's a wonderful place, and I got that pride from my mother, and I think it kind of lives on hopefully in this book.
I would say so. I can second that as well. As I said, finished it last month, knew very little about football in Colombia outside of the big teams, so getting that insight into it, getting the insight into how this infrastructure came about. And again, context is always important here. And I'm always a big believer, our listeners will know this, of that football is so much more than just 90 minutes that happens on the pitch. There's all these other things that swirl around it, and the book captures that perfectly. But likewise, and again, the sentiment of it is that there's so much more that you can take from it than just this was a really shit period in what Colombia is known for. And I think a lot of people who saw the Colombian team at the 2014 World Cup will know from the joy that they had, the hope that was actually bringing to people, because like you said, that was the first team in a completely new cycle, and ultimately that's what is going to be moving forward. That's what Colombians and other people need to see and need to hope for, as opposed to just being stuck in this period. But David, thank you very much for joining me today. This has been a fantastic chat, and thank you once again to all of our listeners who've tuned in. If you have any questions about this episode, or if you want to suggest a topic yourself, you can DM us on any of our social medias, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. David and I are going to jump over to our new Patreon exclusive feed to talk about his new upcoming book, Killing Maradona, which is coming out in May. So if that's something that you're interested in, please do go and check out our Patreon. All of our exclusive content is over there. You can subscribe for £3 a month, and that gets you an extra podcast every single week. Otherwise, that'll do us for today. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.